This webinar is Reconciling Science and the Arts with Tyreek Jackson. And I'm really, really excited to have Tyreek here. He and I met at Berklee College of Music a few years ago. And then, as most people expected, he went on to do some pretty incredible things in the field of science. And now he's going to speak to us about kind of connecting the two worlds. So I'd like to say a little bit about Tyreek, just so people know who he is. And please look him up online as well, not only just to find out more about this work that he's going to speak about, but certainly to find out about Tyreek Jackson, the musician, who is incredibly impressive. And he's a multi-instrumentalist. He's going to laugh, but you know, I mean, we can't take these things, you know, listening to about ourselves, but I'm still going to tell the truth. So anyway, so Tyreek Jackson is a musician, scientist, and professor based out of New York City. A bassist, guitarist, and composer by trade, Tyreek has had the pleasure of working with artists across the musical spectrum, from jazz and metal to hip hop and flamenco. Currently, Tyreek serves as a member of collectives including Adam Neely's JAZZSCHOOL, Bright Dog Red, the Hudson Horror, the Illusory Self, Twin Chord, and Infinite Ethos. Most recently, he has released original music under his own name, an amalgam of his love for jazz and progressive metal. Alongside his musical pursuits, Tyreek currently serves as assistant professor of music and neuroscience at St. John's University and is a researcher at the Language and Cognition Lab at Columbia University. Tyreek's research focuses on mapping the neural topography of musical improvisation, the role of working memory and improvisation, and neural connections of music across other domains of cognition. His personal mission is to increase the ecological validity and diversity in music neuroscience research. His most recent published research includes a study about sonic perception through hand shapes on the guitar, and a study about improvisational experience as a predictor of how musicians will categorize harmonic function. Tyreek holds a bachelor's from the Berklee College of Music and a master's and doctoral degree from Columbia University. And I'd also like to say that Tyreek sent me a link to his papers, his research papers, and in the YouTube section below the video, I will put that link so you can read more about Tyreek and his research.
So, welcome everybody. Thanks to Andy for setting this up. I really appreciate it. And thanks to you guys for coming by and hanging with me while I talk about reconciling science and the arts. So first off, reconciling. So reconciling is to make consistent or congruous. And I think what that means as far as science and the arts go is interesting because, you know, in my perspective, science and the arts have never really been enemies. I think they've always been somewhat congruous, but the way that, you know, they're kind of treated in society, in my opinion, has been different. So, you know, science is often put on this kind of pedestal or put into a glass box, and, you know, it's very insular in a lot of ways. And, you know, we have pop scientists like Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse or Michio Kaku, and that's great, but, you know, the process, the actual nitty gritty of doing science is, you know, somewhat obscure, I think. And I think art is treated similarly, but, you know, with different conditions. And, you know, some of the same things happen in art where, you know, sometimes we don't really know what the artistic process looks like, but, you know, art is almost always kind of put at a lower level unless you are one of these artists who really just happen to make it big. And I've always found that to be kind of strange because the processes are so similar to me. And so this is, I call it reconciling, but it's really just kind of illuminating how similar these two things are, and just shining a light on the bridge that already exists between science and art. And how do we do that? So the first step is to just demystify the processes. So really talking about what it means to do science in a lab, and how mundane that can be sometimes, and how exciting it can be at other times. And the same thing with music. Oftentimes the final product in music is great, it's amazing, but the steps to get there are often sometimes mundane. How often do we find ourselves as musicians or producers just sitting there at the console, making the smallest, tiniest edits? That's not exciting work, but part and parcel of the process. So it's really just about demystifying these processes in both, and deepening our understanding of the similarities and differences that exist in both practices, and exploring how science illuminates art. So how can we actually, in the lab, shine a light on what it means to be an artist, what's going through an artist's mind, or something like that. And how can art then enhance the scientific pursuits? And finally, I want to touch on some calls to action for the present and future. And I think given what's been going on in this country, be it the pandemic, be it this this energy that we've gotten in the Black Lives Matter movement, and some of the reactions that we've seen from that, I think now is as good a time, probably the most critical time to just put out these calls to action from people in scientific institutions who actually hold quite an enormous amount of power. So what this means in this talk is, as far as demystifying the process and deepening our understanding, what it comes down to for me is asking meaningful questions. And I'll talk about, what kind of questions can we ask in the scientific process to help us get there, some challenges in design and how we can perhaps overcome them, and constructing the story in the scientific process and experiments and writing papers. And then science illuminating art, we're going to talk about basically what I've done to start that conversation, and perhaps open up a discussion about how musicians in particular can use scientific research in their practice, and some ways in which how musicians can conduct their own research, which I think is something that can be quite useful in all aspects of performing music and recording music. So a little bit about me, and I'll leave this a little bit vague just in case people have questions. Y'all all know me, but but anyway, so in high school I was really into music and math and engineering, but music was definitely a passion for me. But I ended up going to college for engineering, so at the University of Rochester. I studied mechanical engineering, which, in retrospect is, I had a good time there, and I really enjoy mechanical engineering. There's actually quite a bit that surfaces in some of the finer things that we do in the lab. But at the time, the pull from music was so strong. By the time I got to senior year and was thinking about internships and all that, it didn't really seem appealing. And so I kind of pulled a fast one on my mother and went to Berkeley to study music. So most of you folks,
Utar.
yes, right. Most of you folks know me from my time at Berkeley, and maybe or maybe not, you know that I had come from engineering school. So I was in that slightly older category, and but for me, Berkeley was an amazing time, and just my formative years, I think, were at Berkeley, and I learned so much from being around all these musicians who um, I might have been the only American on the stage, actually, at this time. But I learned a lot, and it really got me thinking about, well, I have all these different experiences as a musician, and I started to think more about, well, what is that, what do these experiences really mean to me? And I wanted to explore what the musical experience was. And, I didn't have the language or, the means of pursuing that at the time. And so after Berkeley, I, spent a couple years up in Boston, playing with Erica, playing with Sean, um, you know, and just doing that thing. And after a while, these questions started to come back. Well, like, what is music experience? And, how can I actually study this? And so in 2012, I decided to go to grad school, and I studied music and cognitive neuroscience in an interdisciplinary doctoral program where you kind of make your own doctoral program. And that's where I met Andrew, and I was so fortunate to meet Andrew, and we kind of went through it together. Andrew was a postdoc, and I was working on my doctoral degree, and we had the same interest, and we ended up doing these research projects together. And being at Columbia and being surrounded by so many brilliant folks was really, again, a part of these kind of formative years for me, and really helped me to shape what it is that I wanted to do, which was to eventually become a scientist and study music and neuroscience, and basically put these two passions together. And so that's what I did. Um, and I didn't know what that really meant or looked like at the beginning of it, and nobody does. But after a while, and especially after I started working in the lab with Andrew on these projects, it really started to click with me to make sense. My experiences as a musician, where you're doing all these different things, and you're doing them on the gig, but you're also doing them when you're writing. You're doing these things when you're practicing. You're having all these really interesting and unique and diverse experiences as a musician. I felt like that was really important to start to introduce into science, because and I'll talk about this a little bit later, a lot of the early um, music and neuroscience papers didn't break these things down. They didn't really talk about experience on such a level, because, and it's fair, because you know in many cases scientists were just trying to figure out, okay, well, what regions of the brain do what, or so they were working at a very kind of gross level. And we have the benefit now of asking more nuanced questions, but I felt it was really important to start asking these questions. And I felt like my experience as a professional musician would really be helpful in getting there, and increasing ecological validity, which is like you said, and Andy, my personal mission, really stemmed from that desire to start to include these more nuanced questions about, you know, well, what does this mean for professional musicians? You know, how can we start to ask questions that would benefit professional musicians or benefit the learning musician? You know, these are questions that would usually be relegated to music education or music therapy or something like that. But I wanted to find a way to start this conversation in cognitive science and neuroscience. And so that's essentially where I'm at now with this, and you know, where Andrew is at now, I think. Right. So some of the things that were really confusing to me at first were really basic questions, like how do you even run an experiment? And the answer is by trial and fire, which you just kind of learn, and you do it and you fail, and then you do it again and hopefully you get better. But you know, a lot of these things aren't things that you hear when it comes to, you know, talking about science. Like most of the times when you read a science, you know, science report, it's usually distilled through the news, you know, like some news outlet, and they tend to water things down. And, you know, they say, well, scientists discovered such and such. And it's like, well, what actually went into discovering that? What did they do in the lab to do it? You know, it's oftentimes like when you read these news articles about scientific discoveries or what have you, they don't even point you to the article that was used to make their news article. And, you know, I think it is problematic because we thereby as a culture, we don't get used to reading scientific papers, and we're not used to understanding the nuance that goes into a lot of these papers. We just see the kind of distilled version of what these experiments do. So reconciling to me begins with kind of demystifying the process. Okay. So first off, what is cognitive neuroscience? What do we do in it? And so cognitive neuroscience, we deal with brain activity, and the cognitive part of it is dealing with information as far as acquisition of information, deployment of information, and storage of information. So this is really, you know, how do you acquire things like language? How do you process sentences? How do you process grammar? How do you process math? And then how you deploy language, you know, so how do you respond to something that someone said, right? How do you store information and then recall it, you know, so dealing with memory. And so what we're doing in cognitive neuroscience is we are looking at how the brain, how the different regions of the brain are associated with these processes. So this involves looking at brain waves or scans. Brain waves is basically, you know, the kind of voltage fluctuation across the scalp. And that's what we use in a lot of music studies, or scans, where you're sitting in some sort of scanner like a MRI machine. Brain waves are typically temporally superior, I should say. So they're better at, you know, time-locked activity, you know, what's happening at this time versus that time, on the order of milliseconds. And scans are spatially superior, so you can look deeper into the brain regions, and you can say, okay, this area is active during this activity, more so than you can with EEG. The gap seems to be closing a little bit, but you know, these principles generally hold. So in music neuroscience, we ask questions about the acquisition, deployment, and storage of musical information. So what that means is you know, if you are a musician, a professional musician or something like that, we're interested in how you process chords, right? We give you some chords to listen to, and we're interested in how you process them, or how you deploy musical information. So how you react to playing a melody, or how you react to a chord progression or something of the sort. So we're interested in doing that. And what we do is we test these hypotheses about information acquisition or deployment using brainwaves and scans, okay? To do that, we go through the scientific method. So we observe things, we think about what questions would be good to ask, and we, you know, write down those questions, then we formulate hypotheses. We then design an experiment. We run a pilot, make adjustments. Then once we've made adjustments, we run the experiment. We assess the data that we collect from the experiment, write it up, and perhaps construct another experiment if we think it needs a follow-up. And once we write it up, we send it off to a journal and hope it gets published, right? So what that translates to, in, I guess, more plain English, is we make observations about music phenomena. And I'll talk more about what specific observations I've made in a bit. So we generate questions and ideas about music phenomena. We design an experiment to test these questions. And then we fight with our computers. I know Andrew's probably like cringing right now looking at this picture of how messy it is. So we fight with our computers to get the design to work. And that's where it gets really, really just mundane and frustrating. And, you know, sometimes you feel like you're doing the same thing and it's just not working. But eventually these problems are solved, and we then recruit participants, we run trials. So, you know, we just test the experiment to see if it works. If I'm recalling correctly, for the improv experience paper that we did, we ran a few trials, and it was like 6 months before we really got the experiment up and running. So, you know, it can take that long. Fixing the errors, recruiting more participants, running the study, analyzing the data, and fighting with the computer again, because there will inevitably be some issues there. You test your hypothesis, you evaluate the results, write the manuscript, send it off to reviewers. Ideally, they accept it with revisions. In the case of our first paper, I think it was rejected a couple times. You know, the journals were perhaps not the right fit or whatever. But eventually it was accepted. If they accept it with revisions, and you make revisions and you resubmit, there can be a very long period in between when you submit your revisions and when they accept it for publication. But hopefully it gets accepted for publication. And also this process could take years, right? So, you know, a paper that is 20 pages long could be the product of 2 years, 3 years of working and waiting and working and waiting. So, like, I think our guitar paper that Andrew and I did was about 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, of working on it and then waiting, and then, you know, events come up, things come up, and then we worked on it some more, submit it. It took a long time to get accepted. And, so it's a long process. And when I was writing this out, it made me think this is very similar to what happens in music. Think about it when you're writing an EP or even one song, right? You have an idea, you develop the idea, you try and construct a story out of the idea or a concept if it's an album. You go through trial and error. So you write songs, some songs may work, some don't work. You go in and you record those songs. Some songs record well, some need revisions and editing and all this other stuff. And to that end, the setup and post-processing time take way longer than the actual active, like the active recording or the active, and then in the case of science, running participants or something like that. That part is the shortest part of the process in a lot of cases, but it's, the design and the post-processing and, getting your stuff actually out there, which takes the longest time. And then releasing your work into the world and finding the right place to do that. And all the while, just kind of maintaining a sense of self, maintaining your sanity throughout the process. Especially when it's work that you're really attached to. Sometimes with scientific work, like you're jumping in on someone else's project, and it's like being a side person on a gig or a side person on a recording. You're there to record your part and just move on to the next thing. And some science projects are like that, but when it's something that you've designed and it's one person or a couple of people, and you spend all this time working on it, then you get really involved in it. You get emotionally invested in it, and just being able to maintain a sense of self is really important throughout the process. So to me, the process of doing science and the process of making music have more similarities than they do differences. The output is going to be different, of course, but there's so many things in common to me, just coming from being a composer and a performer to being in the lab, that the way you maintain your sense of self is to me, it's identical. So I hope that that part of it, just to kind of expose the process of making science, I think is really important, especially when we talk about the artistic process and the scientific process, because they're very similar. And knowing a little bit more about this, then we can move on to deepening our understanding. And this to me is really perhaps the most important thing, is asking meaningful questions. And it's something that can really make or break an experiment, and really kind of determine how much the results of this experiment are going to contribute to the greater body of work in the field. And so to me, reconciling science and art resides in good questions. Questions that are able to reach out to perhaps a greater audience, but still maintains the integrity and principles of the scientific process. And so just to highlight where we've come from in music neuroscience, I pulled up a couple of early studies and just kind of boiled their primary questions down to these one sentence liners. So some early questions in music neuroscience were questions like, how do brain regions respond to different emotional musics, right? How do musicians' brains differ from non-musicians' brains, right? And, you know, on the surface, these seem like fairly straightforward, fairly non-controversial questions. And again, given the historical context of these questions, and it's not that long ago, but 1999 and the other one's from 2003, I think. But in the context of music neuroscience, that's kind of at the genesis, really. It's really at the beginning. But in the context of history of music neuroscience, these are fairly valid questions to answer, because starting from zero, you have to ask very broad questions. Now, I'll get into what I think about these questions now, and the issues that I have with these questions a little bit later. But, you know, these are the papers that I'm referring to. So the first is Ann Blood's paper from 1999. And the title is Emotional Responses to Pleasant and Unpleasant Music Correlate with Activity in Paralimbic Brain Regions. So basically, music that sounds pleasant or unpleasant has an effect on the emotional part of the brain. And on the surface, this is like, okay, but then you start to dig deeper into what that means. Like, what is pleasant music? Or what is unpleasant music? How do they define what pleasant music is, or what unpleasant music is? Now, these are questions that can open up a huge can of worms. And, you know, these are often questions that, like, I think sometimes when artists feel threatened, musicians feel threatened, they'll be like, well, you know, that's so broad, you know, it can be anything. You can't define what pleasant is and unpleasant is. Within narrow parameters, you can make an argument for it. And I think they do in this paper, but the question on its own merits is really, it's gonna breed this challenge from artists and musicians. And I think it only serves to kind of open up this can of worms that, you know, eventually down the line, we're going to have to answer for. So 20 years down the road, we're going to have to pursue this question further and kind of make more sense of it. Because what is pleasant music? What does that mean? Right? Here's the other. Brain structures differ between musicians and non-musicians. Okay. So in this paper, they take these, I think they're resting state scans of professional musicians, and you'll see that they compare professional musicians as keyboard players, right? That's interesting. With a matched group of amateur musicians. What are those, right? And so they look at the differences between them. And, you know, again, they're very early studies, and you know, so they're starting from a very basic level, but the questions are really kind of, to me, they're a little funky. They're a little weird. They say that professional musicians are keyboard players, and they might have a criteria, right, for what they're defining as professional musicians. But again, in studies like this, it's going to eventually start this uprising. You know, if people investigate it further, like, well, what does that mean? So in the context of the late 90s and early 2000s, I think these questions are appropriate, but I don't think they're very good questions in the context of 2020, because we've realized that, you know, there are many different kinds of professional musicians, right? They're not just keyboard players. And we realized that what does amateur musicians mean? There are many kinds of amateur musicians. and not all of them play classical music. And so there are lots of things that we're starting to come around to now. So as time marches on, more nuance is critical to reconcile science and the arts. We've realized that, the arts are much more diverse than science has been treating it for the past 20 plus years, past 30 years at this point. And so now we need to start asking more nuanced questions to address that. And we need to aim for ecological validity. So again, my personal mission is to increase the ecological validity, and to do that through introducing diversity into scientific practice through a number of means. So asking more diverse questions, right? Having a greater diversity of people involved in scientific projects, and so on and so forth. And I think what that will do is give us a more open kind of view, a more robust kind of view of the arts through the lens of science. So ecological validity, again, is basically like how can this work generalize to practical musical applications? And that hasn't been happening. If we look at a lot of the early music studies, and we look at really not even early, but like early up to maybe 2015 or maybe even later, one thing that you'll see in a lot of studies is they're primarily based on classical music. So they're primarily based on the works of Beethoven or Bach or Mozart, and they use these as like stimuli in the actual experiments. That's one thing. Another thing is many of the experiments that you'll see when they do recruit musicians, they're often violin players or keyboard players or something like that. So in terms of what musicians play, we're looking at a very small subset of instrument diversity. So that's another thing. And that's huge, right? Because we're looking at a very narrow band of musics, and then saying that the results from these experiments say something about music, right? They say something about a kind of music, for sure. But can these results generalize to other kinds of music, right? Can I say that a Senegalese musician who plays Mbalak's music harbors the same kind of traits? I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but I don't know. It would be hard to make that argument given the consistency by which many scientists have used the same stimuli, used the same general body of participants in their studies. There's an argument there that, especially if your research is in a lab on a university campus or something like that, the recruiting that you're going to do is going to consist of musicians who are at the university. And in many cases, the music programs around the country don't focus on contemporary music. And so, some will argue, well, we're just doing what we can given the population that we have, which is also interesting. Right? So we have to break this mold, in my opinion, to get to a point where we can start to reconcile science and the arts more. And how we do that is we ask more nuanced questions. So rather than talking about the neural differences from musician to non-musician, let's talk about the differences from musician to musician. So how do certain experiences influence cognition amongst musicians? So if you are an experienced, as I'll talk about in a bit, if you are an experienced improviser, how is your general cognition, let's say, different than someone who is also a professional musician or a working musician, but doesn't improvise, right? So we can start to kind of break this mold or break this shell of treating musicians as one giant body in studies and start to look at differences among musicians, because I think there are significant differences among musicians, which we'll talk about. Is there instrument-specific cognition? So we did a study with guitarists, and you know, as a guitarist, I recognize like how weird the guitar is as an instrument, and I would think, and we prove this to a certain extent, that there is a kind of cognition that comes from handshakes, and I'm sure that's going to be different than playing piano, right? Piano has a one-to-one mapping. The guitar has a many-to-one mapping. So you can play the same note, right? You can play the same note on different positions on the guitar. On the piano, it's you play that one note in that position, and that is it, right? So there's got to be some difference there, right? So if we start to treat instruments as, you know, a point of difference, then we start to open up this entirely new world of possibilities to study music and musicians, right? And you know, there's certainly a lot to say about how we treat instruments, which is kind of it's a weird thing to hear that come out of my mouth, but there's a certain way that we treat instruments, and there's a kind of a hierarchy of instruments in this country. So like, you know, the piano, the violin, the flute, you know, sometimes they're considered high class instruments, whereas like the congos are just like this animalistic instrument. And where does that come from, right? So how does musical structure influence cognition, which is something that I personally am invested in, because outside of, there have been a couple of really influential people to really look at music structure and kind of integrate it into neuroscience practice. But like outside of a couple of names, analyzing music structure has been relegated to music theory. And I think the way I see music theory is it's really just another part of our psychology. And you can see this in the way that we treat musical systems around the world. So if you go to Senegal, as an example, their musical system is really tied into their language. So they often communicate through rhythmic patterns, right? That's their music theory. That's a part of their psychology. And Western music theory has different principles. Indian music theory has different principles. So it's really about starting to understand structure, musical structure, as a part of psychology, and then thereby as a part of neuroscience, right? So if you grow up entrenched in a musical system, you've developed a kind of neuroscience around that. You've developed a kind of psychology around that particular system, which might be different depending on where you go. So starting to introduce music structure into neuroscience studies is something that I'm also very much so interested in. And I think, again, it is a more nuanced question to ask. Now, the thing is with these questions, and I think the reason why it might be difficult for some to broach these subjects is because what you'll also find is that, you know, there are a fair amount of scientists who do music studies but don't actually play music, or may play music but, you know, don't do it at a professional level, or don't do it at even really an amateur level. And I don't say that to knock them, but I think it's important to acknowledge this, because I think what it does is when they formulate these kinds of studies, they don't have the viewpoint of someone who perhaps plays music professionally. And so they don't have that kind of set of experiences to call from, which, again, I don't think is necessarily a negative thing, because you can actually pick up some interesting viewpoints about music from that. But I think we're also missing a lot of potential there. And so it was really great, and this, just a side note, it's really great to come across someone like Andrew and work with Andrew, because Andrew is a composer and a pianist, and you know, he's another professional musician. And so I think we were able to come up with some studies that really kind of tapped into some of the experience that professional musician would have, and but while still maintaining you know, the science and the integrity of the scientific process. So how do we do that in more specific means? So some of the experiments that I've done with Andrew are as follows. So we did an experiment way back. I think we started it in 2016. It got published in 2018, called Improvisation Experience Predicts How Musicians Categorize Musical Structures. So it was Andrew and I and our PI, Paul, who was the coolest PI. He sometimes maybe a little too laid back, but super cool dude. Anyway.
Tyreek, what is a PI for those of us that don't know?
Oh, it's basically the head of the lab.
Okay.
Right. The person who is in charge of the lab. So it stands for principal investigator. And so here's some observations that we made. You know, that's kind of the first part of the scientific method, is making observations. And in our conversations that Andrew and I had while, you know, working on this, we came across the following points. Improvisation is a unique skill present across many domains. So if you are speaking without a script, you're improvising, right? You may have some things formulated that you want to say, but the way that they come out is temporally sensitive. So they're coming out in that moment. You're not calling up a speech, or you're not reading from a teleprompter or what have you. So, and there are many things that we improvise throughout the day. Okay. Improvisation is ingrained in some musical styles, but not others, right? So in Latin jazz, or, you know, just regular jazz, right, improvisation is at the core of that style. But if you look at progressive metal, let's say, virtually none of it is improvised. right? All of it is written. Or you look at classical music, right? Most of that is written. It didn't start out that way, but eventually it became a primarily written form of music. Some musicians express discomfort and dread improvising, while others feel extremely comfortable, right? So, and I have some really funny memories of bringing people into the lab to do the experiment, and they were really concerned that they were going to be improvising during the experiment, and they weren't. I'll explain what they did, but they weren't actually improvising. But they were really concerned that, well, yeah, I suck at it, or, or whatever. I'm like, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. But I found it really interesting that, like, people who don't improvise are really scared of doing it. And, like, looking at the score, reading off of the score is, very comforting. It's a safe space for them, which is interesting. And it just kind of highlights the fact that when you train in music a certain way, you get really used to certain things, like having a score in front of you, right? Or learning things by heart, or interpreting certain symbols compared to other symbols, which is something I'll touch on. Okay. And speaking of which, symbols. So, as we know, symbols in when reading a score or reading something like tablature look a certain way. And symbols when reading a lead sheet look a different way. And so we thought, well, there has to be something to this, right? If you spend your entire musical career looking at a score, and I'll pull up, I had this example somewhere. Okay. So this is from my dissertation, and I highlight two examples, right? So this is Eider Down, which is a Steve Swallow song. And here's one version of it, right? This is a lead sheet version of it with the melody is printed, but the underlying chords are not. And this is another version of Eider Down where the chords and the melody are printed. And so if you spend your entire musical career looking at this, you may not be very comfortable when you get something like this. Because what this is saying is play this chord with these particular notes, but do it in any configuration you want, right? Which leaves open this space to reharmonize the chord or play it with a different rhythm. So you have all of these options for playing the chord. Whereas in this version, you aren't necessarily given the option. And so we thought there has to be something to this. So our hypothesis was that musicians with more improvisation experience, so exposed to things like that kind of lead sheet or training to play over these kind of chord symbols, will process the auditory tasks that we gave them on a global level, which means they'll kind of look at it as a chunk of music rather than kind of picking apart the finer details of it. So what they were given, and I'll show you, is this. So we gave them these different chord progressions. Here is the original chord progression, and for each original there were two kinds of deviants, so two kinds of alterations. One where the middle chord was inverted, and one where the middle chord was of a different function. So if this was a 2-4-1, the first kind of deviant, exemplar deviant, would be a 2-4-6-1. So same chord quality, but different inversion. And here you have a 2-5 one, which would be a functional deviant. So the 5 has a slightly different function than 4. And basically, long story short, we thought, okay, um, the improvisers are going to pay attention to the functional change more because it's kind of a greater change. Whereas the folks who have less improvisational experience are going to hear both changes with equal similarity, right? So they're paying attention more to the local changes between the three, whereas the more experienced improvisers are paying attention to kind of the overall change. So an inversion is basically the same thing, so they won't really notice it so much, right? Because you're used to inverting chords in different ways, given kind of the physical situation. So if you're up high on the guitar neck, you're going to voice chords in a certain way compared to low on the guitar neck, and tempo and all these other things play into that. And so if you're used to doing that, you're probably going to focus more on like functional changes rather than just substituting one inversion for another. And so we found that. And I'll share this video with you, but Adam Neely actually did a video about this. So you can check that out if you want. But we found that there was indeed a difference, and it's cool because we were able to, just the brain activity on its own merits reflected this difference. And so these are the kind of questions that I think will be very fruitful for asking further questions like, okay, so what about the nuances of the musical structure? What if we took that middle chord and we made it something that was totally non-functional, or we spread the voicing into something with an extreme low and extreme high, right? So these are like more nuanced questions about, okay, what about the actual content, the musical content? What about other musical experience? So if you're an experienced blues improviser compared to an experienced jazz improviser, is there a difference there, right? Could there be some sort of instrument influence, right? So for our samples, we used the piano, and we saw that there might be some influence of the piano, but could there be, what if we use a guitar, right? Or what if we use strings, or what if we used a synthesizer? Could there be some influence of instrument there? So what if we went and tested all horn players, or tested all drummers or something, So asking that one question allowed us to then kind of go down the road a little bit further into other aspects of being a musician. How did these other aspects of musicianship factor into the musical experience and categorizing musical structures? Okay. So here's another one that I'm working on currently, and this is called Working Memory as an Improvisational Controller. And the idea is that some of the things that I notice is that the music environment and structure is dynamic, right? Especially when you're improvising. The particular environment you're in, even the physical environment that you're in, has some influence on what you play. So if it's a really good night and you're getting a lot of good feedback, good energy from the crowd, you play differently, right? I've noticed that. I think maybe some of you folks have noticed that. And I think that's a real thing. And I think these dynamics seem to then they influence what you improvise, right? If you're improvising. And I think the ability to recall bits of information also play into this. So when I talk about the musical environment, I'm talking about the physical environment where music is played, but then also the musical structure. So if there are changes to the musical structure, so let's say you raise the tempo or you lower the tempo, I think that's a significant factor in what you then play. And on the cognitive side, we have this thing called working memory. It's basically how you manage incoming streams of information and rehearse it, and then perhaps produce it in some way or store it for long-term recall. And I happen to believe that this also is an important factor in improvising. And so my hypothesis for this kind of work is that improvisers will recall hard-coded information when under high cognitive load. So working memory in this case serves as kind of a gate, right? If the musical conditions are ideal, which means the tempo is just right to where you can get ideas out, get feedback from your fellow musicians, get feedback from yourself, and then produce more information from that, produce more music from that, then you have the ability to produce more unique bits of information. If you're under high cognitive load, it's harder to do that. And the nature of the structure, in my opinion, is really important for predicting that. So again, a good musical environment will be one that, maybe the tempo is not too slow, but also not too fast. The chords are really forgiving. So maybe it's a blues, right? So you can work those pentatonics. Compared to something like giant steps, right? Where you have this constant modulation of keys. And so you have to be a lot more on your feet when you're improvising over something like that. So there's some relationship there between, your ability to kind of manage incoming information and hold it for a while and then produce on top of that, and other aspects of the musical environment, like tempo, like complexity of harmony, like syncopation, like what your bandmates are throwing at you. And holding all those things in, I think, are big predictors in what it is you're going to play. Now, we might know this intuitively as improvisers, but when it comes to looking at this in the lab, these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And I think it's worthwhile because we can start to integrate more of the music structure, the aspect of the music structure in science research, which I think is really important and something that we don't often look at because, again, a lot of experimenters have little experience with music and composing music. But we all know that feeling when you get the right chord, or you get to a point where there's just this kind of dynamic in the music and it does things to you, right? It makes you feel a certain way and you play differently when you get to that point. And so, my questions are, okay, so what is that, right? What does that mean? Is there some kind of neural component that reflects that in the brain? And I think the more and more we ask questions like this, the more we can start to reconcile science and music. So I'll talk about art illuminating science real quick. And I think, in my opinion, science has more work to do to make amends with art than art has to do to make amends with science. But I think art just has to show more of itself and expose more of the process. Because like I said before, I believe the process of creating science and creating art are very similar. And I think the more and more we see the actual process of producing something like a piece of music, we can start to illuminate the connections between the artistic process and the scientific process. Finally, calls to action. And for further reconciliation, I think we need a greater diversity of viewpoints to get to questions that really get to this nuance that I think, Andrew and myself are really like working hard to do. We need a greater diversity of viewpoints. Now, we were at an advantage because we both, trained as musicians and then trained as scientists. And so we have a diversity of viewpoints. And I think overall, as a culture of scientists, we need to do that more. And how do we do that? More outreach, more opportunities, and more visibility. So more outreach basically means getting out there into the community and talking about science and really kind of breaking down and demystifying the process of science, but then also exposing science to folks who, may not have it in their lives, may not see it, and really kind of hold it as this abstract thing that they occasionally read about. More opportunities. And, this is going to come from institutions reaching out and really putting their dollar where their mouth is, right? So it is all the stuff I was talking about before with these kind of questions and the stimuli that scientists use, and all of it really kind of points to this undercurrent of, at least this particularly in music neuroscience, but in general, Eurocentric views in science, right? And the reason why is because there aren't very many Black folks, brown folks in this kind of work, in neuroscience in particular. In other fields, sure. Engineering, sure. But in neuroscience, there is a serious lack of diversity, and there aren't, and part of that is because there aren't very many opportunities. More visibility. I think, being in a lab and doing your work and, just kind of leaving it at that, sometimes that's cool, but for those who can handle it, I think there needs to be this shift in the culture to really being more open and talking more and being more present in the community at large, the community locally, because especially what you see at the university level is, you have, if you're in grad school, and it's a bit unfair of me, but as a New Yorker, I feel this kind of way, but like, you see folks that come into Columbia and they do their shit, they go and they research, they stay in the lab, and they go home, and that's it. Their culture is in the lab, right? And that is that. They might do the occasional, like, outreach thing for the community or whatever, but that's that. But I think there's a real danger, is a real problem when you are not connected to your community. And I don't think you can hide behind, the virtues of doing science. I think it's somewhat irresponsible. Now, there's obviously, if you're working with really intense materials and you're working, you know, in an intense field, yes, it's going to be time consuming, but, you know, even if you're just acting as a citizen, I think being visible is really important. So I think these things need to happen. And if they do happen, we'll get closer to this kind of highlighting the bridge between science and art. Because art lives in the community, right? Art is, you know, there's so much art that comes from more of a communal kind of culture. And I think the more that science reaches out to that community, I think it'll be better. Okay, so transparency. This is a huge problem in science. And the thing I am consistently frustrated about is access to science journals. Like I was talking about before, there is almost always a kind of paywall. So when you are exposed to science research, it's almost always filtered through some sort of news outlet. And you get a watered down version. And then if you want to read the paper, then you have to go through all these steps, and then your PDF is like $35 for a science article, which is ridiculous. And then nobody actually wants to read science work because it's too much money for one. And then that creates more problems because you don't build up a tolerance for scientific papers. Some of them are extremely dry. Let's just put that out there. But being able to kind of parse the information and kind of break the information down is really, it's really good skill to have, and we don't build that. So that's something that we collaboration with non-scientists on scientific work, and I think that goes the other way too. I think as artists, I think it might be a very good thing to start reaching out to scientists and collaborating. You know, I think there's sometimes this kind of fear that, you know, maybe as an artist, like the scientists won't understand what I'm trying to do, or vice versa. I think when you get to it, when you actually start interfacing with, you know, a scientist, or if you're a scientist and you start interfacing with an artist, I think there's almost always this kind of, there's good energy, and good things could come from it. And, you know, it's really just kind of getting out of the bubble of, you know, art, or the bubble of science. So that's really all I had for this. It might have been a lot, I don't know, but
That was so great, man.
thank you. Okay, so let's.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see if anybody has any questions. I certainly do.
Sure.
So just because it's me, I'll start. Well, I would say my first mundane question, when you showed the picture of the computer and you were saying how frustrating that part of the process can be. Do you guys actually, are you creating programs for these studies? Like, do you have to actually understand how to create a program with coding and whatnot?
Yes, in fact, I'll show you one. I was gonna show this, but I'm actually worried about the audio, so I won't. But basically, here's a program that I wrote. Can you see this?
Yeah.
So here's a program that I wrote, and this is actually the program for the work and memory study that I'm doing now. And I use MATLAB. And so, you know, that's something that when I came out of Berkeley, I was really not prepared to do. But yeah, I learned how to code to do this kind of stuff. But yeah, you write programs. This is a program. And I'll tell you what this is, because COVID really kind of messed things up, and I can't do this experiment right now. But basically what I have folks doing is when they come in the lab, they'll get these instructions to play. Well, first they'll get these instructions to count the number of these colored screens, so red, green, or blue. And all of this stuff here, it basically just randomizes the colors that'll flash on the screen. And this starts the program for that. But basically, they count the number of screens that they see. And while they're doing it, they're supposed to improvise over either a blues or giant steps. And
as they're counting the colors.
As they're counting the colors. And either in one of three tempos. So I think it's 100, 160, or 180, and 260. So
yo, that's stressful.
That is really stressful. But the idea is to like see how much load I can put you under,
right,
and how that will change the nature of what you play. So high tempo giant steps, and you're trying to count colors. My hypothesis is that you'll fall back on hard-coded information, so scales.
Right.
Yeah, and very simple kind of rhythmic patterns and things like that.
My hypothesis is that you'll get some walkouts.
But I was telling folks, it's like, yeah, don't worry about the improvisation, because I am only mildly interested in that.
Yeah.
I'm more so interested in like the patterns that you generate. I don't really care about the notes.
Yeah.
So much. That's more about like how you
that should be your opening line when they walk in.
But if I tell them that, then
yeah, of course.
So yeah, we write programs. I have some other programs here that I'm working on. This is like the most frustrating part of
I bet
science, I think, is writing programs.
Yeah.
But it's a great skill to have. This is one that I'm doing. This is like a data analysis program.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like the most fun part of writing programs for me is like this kind of stuff. So I'll write in like loading data, and it'll tell me when I'm loading data, and then, oh, the data's loaded. So it'll tell me, oh, it's finished. So I have all these like little messages that I write to myself, like, oh, it's finished, stuff like that.
Little coded cats on the back.
Yeah. Time samples information loaded. Proceed to step 3. It's just like, these are just, just stuff to make it a little more interesting.
Coding humor.
Right. But stuff like this is it's, I would say, the most kind of mundane aspect of it, but also, this makes or breaks the experiment. So you have to have this stuff, right? So, it takes a lot of time to get this stuff together, and it can be really frustrating, but yeah, that's what we do. Now here's a dirty secret. Some scientists don't do this. They have, if you're on a big, if you have a big lab, in a lot of cases, you'll have a computer science person, like a dedicated computer science person, and they'll write code for you. And you'll have a dedicated stats person, and they'll do all the stats for you.
Right.
That's fairly common.
But that's not your case.
It's not my case. Our lab is, the lab I was in before with Andrew is very small. So we just did all the stuff ourselves, which probably, when it comes to timelines, probably extended the timeline by like 3 or 4 times what it might have been. But there is something, to be said for writing your own programs and making sure they work, and the code. So if there's something wrong with the code, you can go back and fix it more easily.
Right.
Than if someone else wrote it, and having all those potential communication mishaps and whatnot. So yeah. So you can see here, like, for instance, I have these WAV files. These are just like, these are straight from the iReal book, right? And I put in what the tempo should be,
Right on.
lead times, stuff like, what is this? Basically telling the program which track to choose, stuff like that. Yeah.
That's really cool. But you're wearing a lot of hats then throughout this whole process.
Yeah, pretty much everything from start to finish, which again, I think it definitely extends the amount of time it
Sure.
takes to do some of this, but for me, I think it's better.
Do you have, now it seems like you're going from idea to idea to idea, and that kind of gives you, you know, a broader sense, and then you break that down little by little in your research. Do you have anything in particular in mind that you'd like to figure out comparing music and how the brain works? Like, are there special projects beyond what you're working on now that you'd like to figure out?
Yeah, I'm really interested in rhythm, and you know, the more and more I think about how like deep and rich rhythms are, and like what rhythms mean to certain folks. I'm really interested in exploring that more. You know, I talked about uh, Senegalese musicians, and I used to work with a Senegalese musician up in Boston, and you know, he had such a unique way of thinking about music, and it's completely orthogonal to how I thought about music.
Hmm.
And so I'm definitely interested in exploring that more, you know, just like how rhythm, and you know, they think like a lot of Senegalese folks think about certain rhythms as melodies, and you know, just kind of the treatment of rhythm as a melody and how that could, you know, then influence, you know, what you do down the road, especially if you're improvising. So I'm definitely interested in going further into the rhythmic aspect. I'm also really interested in music as just like connecting music neuroscience and music therapy in particular,
Mm-hmm.
because I think music therapy is a really interesting field, and you know, it's connected to a lot of hospitals, so obviously people treat it very seriously, but I want to go further into that and how, like, you know, basically like generating music, so creativity in composing music, how that has some sort of therapeutic effect. But for right now, you know, working on working memory in particular, so all of this different aspects of memory are really my jam right now.
I'm really curious about that one. I'm the kind of musician who came from reading first, and I actually think that has been a problem for me when it comes to memorization, because
Hmm.
I didn't come from memorization first. I came from just reading gigs,
Hmm.
and I'm always so curious about improving my memory and memorization when it comes to music, because it's definitely not my strong suit. So I'm very curious about memory and music.
Yeah, me too. I think memory is kind of like I allude to in the title. I think it's really kind of a controller, or like a gateway
Mm-hmm.
into unlocking the further like channels of creativity, um, because working memory really thrives on the principle of holding information for a short period of time, but then like rehearsing it, and either utilizing it or storing it. And I think what that means for, you know, the jazz musician or other improvising musician is being able to hold a phrase and develop that phrase in this, you know, time sensitive moment that you're in. And that could really kind of lead to something blooming, or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that particular idea dies and you go on to another idea. It could really derail you too if you know, the idea doesn't develop the way that you want it to. But I think you know, looking at working memory and how that kind of holding these bits of information for this short period of time, I think is really important in understanding like more of the topography of improvisation. So, you know, how that looks in the brain and how different networks of the brain kind of coordinate to allow
Right.
you to then improvise.
And I think the information that you find out could be really useful in a teaching setting, actually informing how to teach to improvisation, teach memory, teach. I mean, it could be really big.
Yeah. So coming back to ecological validity, right? And, you know, basically how can we generalize the results of this experiment or set of experiments into real world situations? That's something that I think about often. And I think, like you said, with working memory in particular, I think that could have some really significant implications in education. And I think, you know, ultimately, since I'm now an educator, I think that that's really important for me to kind of link the research that I'm doing to education at the least. So memory is one of those things that we live in an age where we don't have to remember much. Computers
Yeah.
tell us a lot. Our phones remind us of a lot of things. Phone numbers are kind of a thing of the past. So I think it's one of those things where it could also reinvigorate or reawaken something that we've always had but kind of lost.
It's lost. It's been lost along the way. If we think about the musicians we grew up listening to, they all just played together. They played constantly, and they taught each other the tunes. And then you go home and you work on them, maybe with a record player, play along, and then you go and play a session. But now everything's on the computer. Everybody has their real books on their phones, on a
Right.
tablet, and people have forgotten how to memorize.
Right. Yeah. So I think you know, looking at memory is, I think, one way to kind of restart that conversation about what it means. You know, it's just like, you know, learning stuff by ear, where you really have to commit you know, to learning it to memory.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I think has been also kind of somewhat lost, somewhat. So yeah, the memory thing is really my jam at the moment. There's a lot to unlock there. And then also, when it comes to the larger body of neuroscience research, there's a lot to dig into when it comes to memory. So people have been looking at memory for a long time. So there's a lot of good information to pull from when designing an experiment, a music-centered experiment, focusing on memory. So yeah.
That's cool. And you had mentioned something about musicians working with scientists as opposed to, you know, just the reverse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what would you suggest? Like, what are some ideas you could suggest as far as like what would be an example of a musician finding a scientist to work with?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think there's a lot of mystery, and it now that I'm on the other side of it, I think it's like it just doesn't make sense to me. But in most cases, like if you're really interested in a paper or something, the simplest thing to do is just email a scientist. And most of the time, you know, like that person will get back to you, and they'll send you the paper, and you know, you might be able to start a conversation about, you know, at least what that work means, but you know, maybe doing something further. So I think it could just start with an email. It's that simple. I I think there's like this kind of weird mystery about, contacting scientists. Like people don't know that they can do it, but you can just send an email. We're here.
I admit it's never occurred to me once.
Yeah, we're here. A lot of us are just professors. We answer emails all day.
Yeah.
So,
but that also goes back to your point that that papers need to be more available to people.
Right. Exactly. And I think the problem, obviously the problem there is like publishers and all that, but the solution is to just email people, and they'll send you the paper. That's kind of the open secret, is to, if you need a paper, just email the professor, email the scientist, and they'll send it to you.
That's cool.
Yeah. And then you can start a conversation from there.
That's great.
Yeah.
I've been asking all the questions. I don't know if there's anybody here that would like to ask a question, Tyreek. I think we have a lot of listeners. Oh, Erica.
I'd love to. First of all, thank you, Tyreek. You've kind of opened up a can of worms in my mind.
Okay.
And I just really appreciate everything that you've been saying in terms of trying to get more diversity in the scientific experience, or experiments and experience. So yeah, thank you for that. And I had a couple questions. My first question is, do you ever lose sleep at night just trying to think of all the things that you're curious about, and also like, troubleshooting the experiments that you're doing? Is that a problem for you?
Yeah, it's a problem. I'm not gonna lie, I've had nights where I've woken up in a cold sweat and just like thinking about like code.
Oh man.
It's really strange. It's really strange.
That's deep.
Yeah. When you're deep in it, and you spend and thankfully I've only done this a few times, but like when you spend like 10 or 11 hours a day with just looking at code and like trying to fix things and whatever, analyze data and moving data from one thing to another, it all you see, like you just start to see the world in like for loops. And,
Booleans.
Yes, Booleans, bootstrapping. No,
wow.
Yeah. So but yeah, the possibilities they're always just kind of there. It's like that with me for music too. Like there's I don't know. It's hard to turn off.
Yeah.
So when you do find yourself in your own loop, do you have a place that you put all of that, or do you just keep it in your brain the whole time?
How much load can you carry?
Yeah, how much cognitive load can you
I started this I have this app called Notability, and it's just like a note-taking app. But I started doing like daily notes. So that's helping a lot. It's just like any random bullshit that I have in my head. I just start writing it down. And that helps a great deal. And I don't worry about like the structure of it or anything. It's just like if I have a random idea, just write it down in Notability. And if it's something worthwhile, then I'll come back to it. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I should quickly ask my follow-up question. I don't want to take too much of your time, but as someone who's worked a lot with children doing like music and art enrichment classes and stuff, one of the things that I noticed right away with kids and adults too is that when they aren't familiar with the musical content, the first thing they seem to latch onto with great comfort and enjoyment is usually the rhythm. And it just always fascinated me, and it really influenced me as their teacher to try to strum more rhythmically, move my body more rhythmically in order to enhance their experience of the music. And so I was just curious if, you mentioned you had an interest in studying rhythm. And then also I see a huge deficit in the appreciation and funding of arts programs in schools for kids. And obviously, we're musicians here and we all agree that it's important. So I was just curious if you at any point have already or are interested in further studying how children play into this in their early development, and maybe how we can, I guess, like, share more of that information with the education community in order to show how important music is.
Yeah, so great questions. To your first question about rhythm, I have looked into it. It was actually it played a minor role in my dissertation material, but I've definitely taken a look at some things within rhythm. And one thing I notice is that what's interesting about rhythm to me is what you just alluded to, in that it's often the first thing that people kind of latch on to. And there are a couple of reasons why. In the brain, it's just a faster thing to understand, basically. And our brain kind of works in rhythm. So we gather information in a timed manner, because our brains like routine, our brains like things to be kind of predictable. So if we can latch onto something that's fairly predictable, so the rhythm's a basic 4/4 rhythm, it's easy for the brain to just kind of form a prediction around when the next event's going to happen, and then coordinate with the rest of the body to basically be involved with that rhythm, or engage with that rhythm. So the information is easier to latch onto compared to, processing pitch variants or something like that. And it's a big part of the reason why, like, you can get if you hum out the melody of something without the actual pitch variation, but maintaining the rhythm, in most cases, people will guess what that melody is, because there are actually a couple of really important works by Fred Laerdal who talk about the importance of grouping structure. So we think about things in terms of groups. So we group rhythms first, and then we kind of overlay the pitches on top. And I think that in general holds across many different musics. So what interests me about rhythm is the layers, and how that then relates to language, because we think about language too in terms of rhythm. So people with good cadence, like Barack Obama, as an example, has great cadence when he speaks. And you kind of remember more of what he said in his speeches because of his cadence, right? So there's some relationship between memory, again, working memory, and your ability to kind of encode chunks of information, rhythm, because rhythm does the actual chunking of information, and then processing that information. So to your other point about how we can start to use this information for kids, I think I'm a part of a group called Brainy, which is brain and then NY, capital NY. And it's one of the chapters of the Society for Neuroscience, but they do a lot of outreach. And I think on the science side, it really starts there. We have to do more outreach. We have to just do the basic stuff that is involved with, being a part of the community. on that end, and reaching out to educators. I think, you know, the educators are doing what they're doing, and you know, because of the problem of access to journals, and because of the problem of you know, perceived problem of getting in touch with scientists, it's not, I don't think the burden is on educators or, you know, visiting artists or, you know, people who are in charge of teaching. I think the burden is actually on scientists to start to do outreach. And then, you know, scientists and being in the lab and things like that, you get grants, you get really used to writing grants and stuff like that. So why not coordinate with some community groups about writing grants, and getting money to fund programs that then start to talk more about, you know, integration of science and the arts. So I think it's more about science actually doing the work that it hasn't done.
All right, Tyreek. Well, then I'm going to hand that problem off to you.
Okay.
So
Sweet.
you're the only scientist I know. So
Sweet. Thank you.
Thank you for answering that. That was really interesting.
See, I have your problem here. Okay.
I do have a question myself, but I don't want to monopolize, so I'll pass it and we can come back if we want. If another person has a question.
No, you go ahead, my friend. I think there's just a few of us here, so please do.
So in terms of so taking education and hard-coded information in the brain to kind of go into sort of the way that we're taught our instrument, I'm just fascinated in this question of how the way that we've been taught on our instrument is based out of tradition and not necessarily based on the science. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping you would be able to kind of illuminate a bit on how, say, for instance, the way that we teach practice and the notion of almost being in the trenches longer than maybe is necessary. Because there's a lot of thought on on visualization training and, you know, mirror neurons and like firing 60%. Like on TED Talks, they say like 60% of the neurons that are being fired when you're visualizing something can be trained. And so I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, you know, there's definitely some tension between what tradition says, and especially in musics that are really deeply rooted in tradition, and what, you know, some things in science or psychology say. Ultimately, I don't know, but I think what should happen is we don't know a lot of the science of playing an instrument, and that's something that we just have to look into. Some of it might agree with tradition, some of it might not, but I think what should happen is the conversation should be opened to science being involved in it. Because you know, I agree, you play a very difficult instrument. You play trumpet. And I'm sure there's like some kind of bro science around, you know, what trumpet players are supposed to do. And, you know, some schools of thought about how you play trumpet. And I know it's definitely ruined some people. So there should be some science that has a say in that, but the problem is just there hasn't been too many people asking the question about, you know, what is instrument cognition, what is instrument physiology, and I think we need to have that. We definitely need to have that conversation. So that's why we did the guitar study, because you know, there's something to be said for hand shapes, right? If you're playing high up on the neck, you voice chords a certain way, and that has an influence on the next chord that you're going to play. That has an influence on the kind of congruency that you see from one chord to another. So there's something to be said for a kind of instrument-specific thinking, cognition. So again, I don't really know. I don't have an answer for you.
I open up only because it's something it's a question that I have, and I was wondering if you had any on that. So cool.
No, I feel you. I know we've talked about this before too, but yeah.
In your spare time, Tyreek, if you could just kind of figure all that out for us.
Got you. I'm looking for my spare time. I don't really.
Just put it in your notability. You'll get to it later.
I'm looking for it.
Keep looking.
It's not in this room.
That's amazing.
Anyway,
I would love to see as this develops more. I mean, obviously, what you just asked is brilliant. I mean, that's the question, really, right? Like, how can we help ourselves and other musicians learn more efficiently and with the information from scientists instead of just, figuring it out, being handed down and figuring it out on our own. I mean, hopefully we get more answers in the future. But man,
I was just going to say, this is exactly why we need to have these conversations with musicians, because if you have a scientist who's studying this work, but doesn't know anything about trumpet playing, they're never going to ask a question like that. And that's okay. But if you're in a conversation with someone, a musician who has experience with that, it then opens up the possibility for that to be a study. So I'm all for, and really what I want to see is more of these kinds of conversations happen. Yeah.
That's cool. And I was going to also say it would be great, since you and I know that, we went to university for music, and I think, wouldn't it have been great if you'd actually have scientists come in and speak to students like this, and actually also let them know that this field exists. I think most musicians don't know that this field exists and that it's something that they could help with.
Yeah. I've been talking to some folks, over at Berkeley about doing something like that, and it's been great to have the exposure from Adam, because Adam is like one of a handful of folks who are starting to bridge that gap, leaning towards the musicians and just kind of showing them this. I'm pretty sure, like, he did that video about our research, and it's been in like 3 of his videos somewhere. Actually, it's in his most recent video too. He had a segment on it. So I was really surprised to see that. But clearly there's more to say, there's more to discuss, and there should be more opportunities for this interaction at all levels, at college, high school, so on and so forth.
Agreed.
So, yeah.
Well, man, listen, I don't know if anybody has any other questions. I think we're there, and I don't want to take too much more of your time. But please, like, if you ever think of anything else you'd like to present and talk about, let me know and let's set it up. There are definitely some people that reached out and said they couldn't make it tonight, but they really hope that you do something else. So let me know.
I will let you know for sure. For sure.
And this was incredible. Like, I hadn't even thought of doing anything like this. And then we were just chatting online, and I thought, of course, man, Tyreek, of all people, this is perfect. So, man, just thank you so much for your time. I know you don't have a lot.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I'm here in quarantine just like everybody else. So.
Excellent, man. Well, listen, I'm gonna have this online tomorrow, and I will send everybody the link. And please, send it with your friends. This is incredible. I didn't know any of this even existed, and now I kind of can't wait to learn a lot more. And I hope that this, gets to people, and there are more people that think the same.
Yeah. Happy to be there to help the process, help communicate this stuff. So, share it with folks. If they have questions, they can definitely reach out to me. You have my email there. So
yeah. Great.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, great to see you, man. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It really means a lot. Thanks for asking questions.
Yeah.
And be safe, everybody. Stay safe out there.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
All right, man. Thanks, Ty. Thank you, everybody. All right. Love you all.
Love you too, man. Peace.